Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're completely bypassing the political talking points to look strictly at the objective math behind New York City's historic rent freeze. To really understand this monumental policy without any bias, we have to separate all that fierce rhetoric from the actual mechanics of city finance and real estate economics. It's a classic economic question, right? Who really pays for a free lunch? When a cost is frozen for one group, does it just magically disappear, or does it shift to someone else? To answer that realistically, we have to follow the money. We need to trace how this single policy decision cascades through the physical buildings, the local economy, and eventually the city's bottom line. So here is how we're going to break this down. First, the historic rent freeze itself. Then, the math behind the buildings, the impact on the housing stock, the ripple effect on the city budget, and finally, the reality for renters. Section 1. The historic rent freeze. Let's start right at the epicenter, June 25, 2026. Fulfilling a major campaign promise, the New York City Rent Guidelines Board voted to freeze both 1- and 2-year leases at exactly 0%. That means for any lease beginning on or after October 1st, landlords legally cannot raise the rent by a single cent. And this decision is absolutely massive in scale. It applies to roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, which is about 40% of the city's entire rental housing stock. We're talking about roughly 2.4 million New Yorkers who will see their housing costs flatline. It's also the first time in the board's history, going all the way back to 1969, that both 1-year and 2-year leases have been frozen at the exact same time. Moving on to Section 2, the math behind the buildings. Now, this is where we start to see the squeeze. According to the Rent Guidelines Board's own 2026 data, while rental revenues are now legally frozen, the total cost to simply operate and maintain these buildings rose by 5.3% over the past year alone. And what's driving that squeeze? Well, it comes down to unavoidable operational costs. A landlord can't just choose to skip out on paying for water or sewer. The data shows an incredible 18.7% spike in insurance costs, a 10.3% jump in fuel, and utilities going up by 8.2%. This brings us to a crucial concept to keep in mind: net operating income, or NOI. Basically, this is just the money a landlord actually has left over after all those operating expenses are paid. So when fixed costs like fuel and insurance rapidly rise, but revenue is frozen at zero, a building's net operating income mathematically has to drop. There is literally no way around that basic arithmetic. Section 3. The impact on the housing stock. That drop in net operating income creates an immediate ripple effect across the physical housing stock. Since the money has to come from somewhere, landlords logically respond by cutting expenses. But keep in mind, not all buildings are the same. Mixed income buildings, the ones with both regulated and unregulated units, can actually absorb some of this shock. They cross-subsidize those frozen units by hiking rents on their market rate apartments. But fully stabilized pre-1974 buildings, they don't have a mechanism to increase revenue. Experts warn that these fully regulated buildings face a real financial doom loop, where rising costs completely wipe out their capped revenues. We also have to consider who actually owns these buildings. Massive corporate landlords can usually absorb these temporary hits by spreading the losses across thousands of units. But smaller, independent mom-and-pop landlords who rely on just one building's cash flow, they are getting severely squeezed. Without that revenue, they're at a much higher risk of struggling to pay their mortgages and property taxes, which could potentially force them into foreclosure or force them to sell out to larger equity firms. Realistically, when owners are facing negative cash flows, they defer maintenance. It's just what happens. Upgrades like new roofs, modern boilers, or energy-efficient windows get delayed because the profit margins needed to fund them simply don't exist anymore. And because so much of this rent-stabilized stock was built before 1974, pushing off maintenance only accelerates the physical deterioration of the city's aging housing stock over the long haul. All right, Section 4, the city budget ripple. Now, you might be wondering, will this rent freeze plunge New York City into massive debt? Well, no, it won't immediately bankrupt the city, but it is going to fundamentally strain the budget over time. Here's exactly how that math works. New York City relies on property taxes for nearly half of its total tax revenue. But for these large residential buildings, property taxes aren't calculated based on what the building would sell for on the open market. They are actually calculated based on the building's net operating income. Because here's the catch. As we see in the Department of Finance guidelines, a drop in net operating income mathematically dictates a lower assessed market value for the property.
When the NOI drops because rents are frozen while costs climb, the city is legally obligated to assess the building at a lower value. And quite simply, a lower assessed value means the city collects less in property taxes.
And this is where the rubber meets the road for literally every New Yorker. By law, New York City has to pass a balanced operating budget. They can't just borrow money to cover daily municipal shortfalls the way the federal government does. So a drop in property tax revenue from 1 million apartments creates a real budget gap. To balance things out, future city administrations are likely going to be forced to either cut municipal services, think sanitation or emergency response, or raise the property tax rate on everyone else, including single-family homeowners and commercial properties, just to make up the difference.
Finally, Section 5, the reality for renters.
So, following the ripple down to the ultimate stakeholders, the renters, what does this objectively mean? Well, for the 2.4 million New Yorkers living in stabilized units, the freeze does exactly what it was designed to do. It provides crucial, immediate financial relief. By stopping housing costs from rising during a period of high inflation, it prevents immediate displacement. It leaves these tenants with much-needed disposable income for food, healthcare, and participating in the local economy.
But there is a spillover effect to keep in mind. In those mixed buildings we talked about earlier, landlords are definitely going to try to recoup their losses by aggressively raising the rent on their unregulated market rate units. That means market rate renters could end up indirectly subsidizing this rent freeze, potentially getting hit with aggressive rent hikes of around 8% or more, assuming the broader market demand allows landlords to command those prices.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. There is absolutely no denying the immense immediate relief that a rent freeze brings to millions of people just trying to survive in a very expensive city. But when you mechanically freeze the revenue of the present while the costs of operations, maintenance, and city services continue to rise, who ultimately pays for the future? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.